everybody. My name's Kate Jenkins and I'm the Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and I'm so delighted we have more than 400 people registered to attend today from all around the world. So we are so delighted. Purna and I were just reflecting on how many people try to cram into those rooms in the UN, and we're really pleased that we could be so open and welcoming to so many people to join us today. I will start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, the Boonwurrung people. I'm just south of the city of Melbourne, and as many of us have been in our homes or really sticking in the places that we're from, I encourage you to consider the traditional owners of the land on which you are attending this session from. As you all know, this is a side event that complements the 65th session on the Commission on the Status of Women that's this year been held both in New York and virtually. This session is being hosted by the Australian Human Rights Commission and has been, I'm very pleased, promoted by a number of you attending. It is being recorded, so just letting you know that, and we will have it available that we will send out to all participants in the next week or so you can share it through your networks, and I encourage you to do so. Today we will be covering content that some people may find distressing, and I encourage you to contact your support services if you need to. We will also have posted in the chat function information about support services in Australia for those of you who are dialing in from Australia. Also, we will start this session by kicking off with a short discussion between my colleague Purna and I, and then we will have a Q&A session. So I encourage you to use the Q&A function in the Zoom box and to post questions as we go so that we've got plenty to talk about when we come to that session. We'll talk for about 20 minutes and then go to those questions. So if I just get straight into it, as I've already mentioned, I'm the Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner. I've been in this role for 5 years. I've had the privilege to attend in person with the Australian Government delegation, the Commission on the Status of Women, each year until last year. And I'm really delighted to be here with Dr Purna Sen, who I have worked with and gotten to know over that period. So Purna, I might hand to you to introduce yourself before we get into our discussion.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for this session, to you, to the Commission, and to everybody who supported it. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody online. It's a real joy to be with you again, Kate, and I look forward to our discussion today and our sharing of ideas of where this work might go next. So just quickly to say who I am. I have just left last year UN Women, where my last role was leading on work to address sexual harassment. That was a role that was created specifically, we'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, a role that was created specifically a few years ago. Prior to that, I was Director of Policy there, but I've got about 30 years or so experience working on issues of violence against women and human rights, and 10 years of work around race equality before that. So I come from very much an equality, non-discrimination background to look at issues of inequality.
Fantastic. So, well, why don't we start in our chat with each other, with a whole lot of people watching, with talking about the journey to how, that moment when the UN announced that there was a spokesperson on sexual harassment, which was you, a new role. You've mentioned some of your career journey, and I'm interested and I'm happy to talk about my career journey to this role. But can you tell us how that role came about and how what was the path for you to get there?
Yes, sure, Kate. And it's interesting because it's a question a lot of people ask, because it's quite an unusual role. It was quite an unusual position that the organization created. So, I worked initially through the 80s in what we call in England post-compulsory education, so after school, and did a lot of work around race equality, particularly in London. And that meant working with refugees and migrants, working with people with learning difficulties, people who had trouble at school and who were having difficulty finding education systems that really worked for them because they didn't fit in many ways. And from there, we might say later, I actually did hear about accounts of sexual abuse during that time and of other violence. And it was something that stayed with me for a while. And as I went back and studied as a mature student with young children in the 90s, it was something that took my heart again, because at school I had actually been fighting against sexism and all sorts of very archaic things at my school, and had got into a lot of trouble and got kicked out of school for it. But from the 90s, I worked back in the area of gender equality, and I studied and I researched and I taught around violence in particular, and international development work, which I'd come to be teaching, and gender within that, what was happening. And one thing that really struck me was how conversations around violence at home, Kate, was so either missing or so different to conversations around violence against women elsewhere. And so I was really drawn into looking at how we talk about these issues, how the differences work, where there are real differences. And through that, I came to do my PhD on violence. I started working with very small women's NGOs. Some were just 2 or 3 people. Then I came to work at Amnesty as directing for Asia and the Pacific, and headed up the human rights work of the Commonwealth, taught a lot in university, put courses together on violence, worked for local government, worked for myself. And then in 2015, I took up a post with UN Women as Director of Policy, which for me was a really nice, logical follow through from working in those many different places where each of those would be stakeholders for the UN. And because of policy work, I'd had research experience, teaching, writing, advocacy campaigning. So for me, it really brought it together in a really very special way. But as you mentioned, while I was there, 2017, the Me Too explosion really took hold of the world in a way that I think the world will not be able to ignore. And we can come back to that, because I think there are certain things over the last year which are a little troubling. And Me Too, it connected women, mostly women from across the world, in denouncing, in decrying, in looking for change. But it also did some things that were uncomfortable for the United Nations. It reached inside the organization. And people who had been abused were talking about the quest for and failure to find justice and accountability. And just as they were in Me Too more generally, they were saying, the systems aren't working for me. I have been abused. I don't trust them. I don't know who I can tell. I risk too much by speaking up. Is it worth it? And in that time, our executive director at UN Women decided that she wanted somebody specifically to lead on this work, to connect with what she saw as a revolution going on in the world. And she wanted UN Women to be placed more squarely in it. And so she created a role and asked me to move from the policy director role into it. I won't go into all the details, but the 3 main parts of the role, Kate, were to coordinate internally within UN Women. So there's different parts of the organization. Human resources deal with cases. There's a violence specialist team that does sort of policy work generally with governments and other stakeholders. Our security colleagues actually on the ground having to deal with cases when they come up. So it was that pulling that together internally. There was leading for UN Women in the UN system as a whole. And you mentioned my spokesperson role, which was a UN Women role, but it actually meant a lot of UN questions came to me too, because there was no other specialist dedicated sexual harassment role elsewhere in the system. And to lead for UN Women in engaging with the world without outside the UN. That's a quick summary. We can come back to more. I'll stop there for now.
It is fascinating. I'll do a quick, because I get asked from young people, sort of, how do I get your job? And it's sort of, I think your description is how I usually answer, which is actually just get the next job and follow what you want to do, what you're passionate about. And because I would never have imagined I would be in the Sex Discrimination Commissioner role when I left university. So a quick version, because in some ways, in retrospect, your career makes complete sense, but as you're looking forward, it actually would have made no sense at all. And I guess in some ways, whilst it's not the only connection, that work on sexual harassment about Me Too was what drew us together. And then our work and our vision on or the challenges on gender-based violence more broadly has, is really the frame that we work in. So my professional background was a lawyer, and in fact, for 20 years, I was a corporate lawyer in a large firm in Australia that specialised particularly in employment and industrial work. I was that classic out of university, get into law because you get the marks, and I didn't want to do medicine. It was one of those very good choices, and in fact do corporate law because I need a job to pay off the debts from my travel, but then ended in employment law and just absolutely love the law that applies to how people, fairness at work, how work is works in a justice sense. 20 years flew by like that, and a huge opportunity. But in that time, the discrimination laws in Australia, which had been passed in 1984 in particular, had really started taking traction in the corporate world. And I guess in my luck, no one else wanted to do that, but I did. So over that 20 years, I have done numerous sexual harassment cases. And to some degree, I got to the end of that. I became the Human Rights Commissioner in Victoria, and then took on this specific role, for those of you who don't know, that sits in the Australian Human Rights Commission. I'm one of 7 specialist commissioners. My role was established under the Sex Discrimination Act, and as a result of our commitments under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So I came to this role. There's a whole lot of priorities we work in, but a bit like you, I was doing work with defence and looking at universities and a whole lot of different projects to advance gender equality, women into leadership, women's economic security. But when that 2017 moment with the Weinstein issue happened, it hit Australia like it hit around the world. And the conversation in Australia that has been steadily and strongly building since, and I think this is where we'll go next in our conversation, is sort of Me Too. So we've been privileged to have Tarana Burke visit us in 2019. In fact, she won the Sydney Peace Prize in Australia for the work and recognising her origin of Me Too and the origins of it, about sexual violence and supporting survivors and helping people move forward. But that kind of Weinstein thing that turned it into a workplace sexual harassment conversation really took traction in Australia, which is why, with the support particularly of our Minister for Women then, we got the chance to do the National Inquiry into Workplace Sexual Harassment, which, Purna, you contributed to. You're extensively quoted in, and this is the lovely, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's quite big, but the executive summary is lovely and small for those of you who want to dabble in that. But so that brought me to there. But actually, when I look back, every time I talk about this, people report cases, and it is very dismaying that these are the same cases I used to do in the 90s. And so in Australia, I think change happens in a way that requires the build rather than the big bang. We didn't have a Harvey Weinstein moment, but we've been having a build towards really demands for change, corporates recognising there needs to be change, community engagement, and now also political engagement. So there has been a build. So why don't we flow on to that in terms of what you think about the Me Too movement and where to next? Because I know when it was about 2 years ago, I was, after 2017, then by 2019, people started to write saying Me Too's failed in Australia. And that wasn't my perspective, but that was it happened, but we never got any big scalps and it's over. Can I just from a global perspective or even a personal perspective, what do you think has happened on this trend towards recognising violence against women, and where do you think it is going, Purna?
Kate, let me acknowledge that Me Too is a groundswell, an outpouring, an agitation that is the first of its kind in many ways, in that it's connected people through social media who will never see each other mostly, who will never be in the same room, who will never be in close proximity to each other, but whose voices, whose expectations and whose hopes have never been more aligned and public than Me Too made them. I'd like to also acknowledge that that was a particular outpouring that came of a moment, but it built on decades and decades of work that has been done before us and on which we build our work now. And I want to acknowledge that Me Too didn't come from nowhere, but it came from a history. You in Australia have done several waves of work around sexual harassment. In different countries, researchers and activists have been calling for attention to sexual harassment for decades. But it took something in 2017 that ignited a different spark. And I believe that Me Too, so it comes from two trajectories. One is that history of activism, of research that's been done, of work that has been done to show that sexual harassment is most likely, and I think most of us will agree this now, most likely the most prevalent form of violence on that continuum that anybody ever knows. And I think we need to come back to the issue of prevalence, because that is something that Me Too demands that we change the way we think about. And I think the second part of the Me Too trajectory is that we had different tools in our box at that point. The pervasive reach of social media was something that hadn't happened before. And even though I think many of us think of it as an extremely toxic space where there is abuse, there is harassment, there is exploitation, somehow, and it's mostly but not all women, were able to make it a medium of their own to connect and to make their presence felt globally. We did a little look at just Twitter, for example, while I was at UN Women, and we found that within 2017 and 2019, Kate, that the Me Too hashtag was used on Twitter at 24 million times. 24 million times in all parts of the world. And so this idea that Me Too is simply about Weinstein, or that it's US based, I think isn't borne out in the reality of how it happened. It's absolutely true that the bulk of those numbers, well, not the bulk, actually, not half, but the largest single proportion of those, about 9 million, came from the USA, but the majority did not. Countries like, Mexico, Argentina, Spain, India, Korea, Japan had massive engagement. And I think Me Too has changed the global conversation. I don't think there is any employer or university or government or politician with any credibility now who can say they don't know what sexual harassment is. And I don't think that was true 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I don't think there is an organization that can get away now with saying, this is normal, this is to be expected. Even if they don't change what they do, I think some of that consciousness about it has changed. And the other thing that I think is significant in Me Too is not only social media was a means through which this movement made its presence felt, but some parts of traditional media, newspapers, TV, radio, broadcast media, came on this journey too. And I don't believe it's over, and I don't believe it's failed. I don't believe it's over because I think we have fundamentally changed the way we think and understand sexual harassment, and that it is most likely the most prevalent form of violence that women experience. Me Too also told us, the women told us, that it is about the links between different forms of violence and the themes that run through them, the themes of lack of belief in women, the themes that trust is missing in our institutions, that our justice systems have not served women well where they've been subjected to violence, that this is about inequality and discrimination. And you mentioned CEDAW earlier. Almost every country in the world has signed up to CEDAW, which promises the end of discrimination. but sexual harassment and violence against women are forms of discrimination. And that, I don't think, is something that can be escaped anymore. I'll stop there. A little more to say, but I'll stop, Kate. Yeah, I'm sure you'll want to come in.
No, well, I was just going to say, I'm looking in the chat. So if I don't look like I'm looking at you the whole time, I'm able to read. So we've got people from Zimbabwe, the UK, New Zealand, just all over the world. And I'm getting such excitement about reading that. The US, Geneva, Canada, and Denmark, and more. So I think that really reflects your comment that this is absolutely something that is universal and global. A couple of things, because I can also see there's some questions coming in, but I'm really interested for you to perhaps talk about two things, because one of the things that many people will know, and we will post these links to some of these resources. But while we were doing our national inquiry that I think has lessons for other countries as well as Australia, you were doing some work pretty actively with a very very expert, but I know quite small team. And you produced some resources and made some global contacts. And I would say, aside from our work, I reference your work the most when people are asking what they might do on this. I'm interested if you just talk about two things. What were the resources you produced? And then I'm going to go back to forward. Tell me about what you've got planned for August and what kind of the dastardly future plan is. So could you talk to both?
Okay, thank you. Okay, I would also like to acknowledge, I think, the complementarity of the work that you've been doing in Australia and what we were trying to do at UN Women. And I think we really fed off each other really well. I'm really delighted that there are so many people from different parts of the world online, and I think that very much reflects Me Too, but also I think the global impatience and demand and hope for a world that is different, that we all share. Our contexts are different. You know, what's happening in Zimbabwe is not the same as what's happening in Denmark or in India, but there are common themes that we're all fighting for, and there are common actions that many of us can take. And there is a question that, if we have time, I'd like to come back to about how we make change in contemporary times. And I don't think it's how we used to think of it. So yes, I had a tiny team. I mean, the office was created, as I said, in 2018, and there was me and 2 temporary staff to take on this massive brief. And one of the things that I felt was useful for us to do, because mine was the only senior dedicated role in the UN as a whole to sexual harassment, is to develop some standards and guidance as to what could be done, how to understand sexual harassment, and what it meant to put survivors and victims first. That was our core principle. And it is, for me, good practice. It is the only way to do good work is to learn from those who've actually been through the experiences themselves, and to learn with respect, not with condescension. And I say that hoping to offer some humility to this work, because I think a lot of us who do policy or legal work can often be a little bit, well, survivors, you know, they're a group apart and, you know, we must treat them this way. But actually, survivors are amongst us all. If we give up, which I think we should, the 1 in 3 figure, I know it's the UN's figure, for the prevalence of women's experience of violence in their lifetimes, and we actually bring sexual harassment into the understanding of what violence is, I think we will be way over 1/3, way over 1/3. And so I would suggest that Me Too has also helped us to rethink prevalence and to understand, perhaps in a more respectful way, that survivors are amongst all of us. So when we talk about practitioners or experts or policymakers or lawyers, we are also survivors in many ways. So what we tried to do was to develop a few resources that we think have been helpful. And firstly, we understood, or tried to help understand, why sexual harassment was an issue, what it is, and what it's about. And for this work, I was really, really fortunate to be able to gain the support and advice of Professor Catherine McKinnon, who is one of the leading global experts, first put the book on our world, in our world, you know, the sexual harassment of working women. And we first of all produced a little handbook which talks about what sexual harassment is in terms of power, in terms of inequality. And it also took on some of the fundamental concepts about sexual abuse. So we tried to move away from issues like consent, because if you understand sexual harassment as unwanted sexual engagement, unwelcome sexual engagement, then consent isn't the right measure for it, Kate, because if you're in a culture of inequality, if your boss is looking for sexual engagement from you and you are frightened of saying no, then you're not really welcoming something, are you? Consent is like a minimum standard. You consent to things you don't want to do under conditions of inequality, essentially. So what we wanted to do is set out some of these parameters. And that was done there. And we also set out really, really briefly some guidance on what effective policy and practice looks like if you're serious about ending sexual harassment. So that was one. We then also produced something on cultural change, because what we saw happening, Kate, and I know you and others in different parts of the world have seen so many organizations quickly put a policy together, or quickly say they've got zero tolerance, or quickly say we've got training, no matter what the training looks like, and say we've done all these things. But actually, the culture of male entitlement, sexual entitlement to women's bodies, the culture that inculcates in women that this is part of life and you just live it, that needs much more work to unpick. And that is long-term, hard work. And so what we did in this second publication was we looked at what cultural change looks like. How do you make it possible to shift from a culture where young staff or even volunteers, you know, I was working at the UN, interns weren't covered by our policy when I took up my role in the UN. Our policies against sexual harassment didn't cover interns or volunteers or various other groups of our colleagues. It was astonishing. We were able to change that. But these sorts of things, I think, have to be named and addressed. And the UN, like any other organization, tends to reflect the world around it. One of the things that I've always said, that no organization should think itself immune, and doing good work doesn't mean you don't do bad things. And so we tried to set this out. But beyond that, we looked at some publications that offer some guidance around sexual harassment in women with disabilities, a group of people who either are often seen as asexual and therefore cannot be harassed, or overly sexualized, in which case, you know, nobody's looking at them and they want this attention and are really problematized, and under the guise of helping somebody with a wheelchair or helping somebody to cross the road, all sorts of harassment can take place, and people with disabilities are particularly poorly believed and given scant credibility. We did a piece of work around women in the informal sector of work, where laws and policies have little reach. Domestic workers, farm workers. We translated our work into Braille. It's the first time UN Women had done that. We produced something also around training, if I might just say on that. One of the things that was very troubling about training, and it's something we learned from work done in Australia by some of your colleagues and others in Canada and other countries, was that their 30 years of work on sexual harassment had shown so much training going on in so many organizations, but that it hadn't done the job. If it had done the job, we wouldn't have sexual harassment happening decades later. And so we commissioned a piece of work reviewing training and coming up with a model that really tries to tackle the underlying issues of power and inequality and discrimination. And so that guidance is there. And there are others. The only other one I will mention now is that I said earlier that Me Too drew the links between different forms of violence, whether it was rape or sexual harassment or child abuse, forced marriage. Women were saying we're all dealing with the same issues and the same problems. One of the things that is apparent in a lot of international work is the separation of sexual harassment from sexual exploitation and abuse, which is essentially what is done by people working at the UN or other international organizations to their colleagues versus what is done to civilians in a simplified version. And we were saying, no, let's join these back together again, because at the UN, they're separated. And so you do have lead roles, and I see Jane Connor's online, you have lead roles that were developed at very senior levels on sexual exploitation and abuse, but sexual harassment hadn't been given that same priority. And so what we were saying, let's join these links together again. There are things in common and there are things that aren't in common, but the continuum is the overarching story. Shall I stop there and then we'll talk about what's next afterwards? Because I think there are links with what you were doing in your report.
Yes, and I'm also looking at questions because we'll round up with what next, because pitch for people to look forward to August. I'm just looking at a range of questions, and some of the things that you've talked about actually go to some of those questions. So how can we get the types of sexual harassment that don't involve extreme violence taken seriously? So I think you were just already focusing on that, and that certainly has been the experience in Australia, this idea that sexual harassment is, if we at the time, I remember the conversation about sexual harassment in Australia came to the everyday nature of it, when in fact, I kept clarifying that Harvey Weinstein, that was actually sexual assault and rape in many of those cases, and false imprisonment. But actually the everyday statistics in Australia is women and some men are dealing with this on an everyday basis. And the underlying concerns about that both create the environment for that more extreme, but actually is harmful in and of itself. Some of the other questions, and I don't want to forget countries, so I'll tell you others that I can see online are Bosnia, Herzegovina, Zambia, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Mexico. I'm just so, and it's not to say I don't love us Australians who are also online. Some of the other questions have, I'll just throw in a few and give a few, because I realised, Purna, you and I could just have this, and we do have these chats to ourselves, but I've got to be responding to those questions. There's a few questions about the review that's been announced in Australia. So for those of you internationally, the last few weeks in Australia has really surfaced for a range of reasons, a conversation about sexual harassment and sexual assault in sort of our parliaments. Also a discussion about sexual assault of particularly schoolgirls, and a conversation and some really great activism to draw attention to the prevalence of sexual assault, particularly in secondary schools, by secondary school boys. We've had an amazing Australian of the Year, a woman called Grace Tame, who is a survivor of childhood pedophilia, grooming by a teacher, and who is speaking very powerfully. So we've this conversation, and Purna, you and I talk about how change happens, and we can cover that, or we can cover other things. But we've had this moment. So some of the questions are about the independent review that the Human Rights Commission has been engaged to, with the support of all independents and cross parties of Parliament, to look at the experiences and safety and respect in our Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces. That has just started, and I can't go into great detail, but I guess to put it in context of how that fits with our Respect at Work report and the 55 recommendations we made, those recommendations were about primary prevention, they're about data and research, they're about the laws, workplace responses, and also support for victim survivors. This really is a piece of work that bounces also off the kind of work you've done, Purna, on looking at that we came up with a view. Recommendation 47 was the best progress is where you take industry specific action. So whilst we recognise this is a universal problem, the nature of the problem happens in a different way in different industries, and you can unpick those power dynamics and the risk factors in a different way. So in Australia, there have been a number of industries that have started to use that approach. I think of the universities, the legal sector, and now this parliamentary review. So I can't give sort of a view on where it will go, but I am really, I think it is really landmark that across the board. The Parliament has said we need to be better and has been prepared to engage an independent organisation with expertise to do that work and hear those stories. So that's sort of in answer to that. I'm just looking at some of them. Other questions were about what other countries can learn from Respect at Work. I sort of named in those big areas some of the things at a high level that we would say are relevant. One is look at how your laws work and apply, because we found our laws weren't really fit for purpose anymore. Are they specifically about the workplace? Looking at the research and data and how you know what's going on, looking how it fits in the broader violence against women work and promotion of gender equality, and looking at what your support avenues are available and the information and the advocacy really for victim survivors. If you are interested in that, I can highly recommend another webinar that Purna, you and I did with a specific focus on that last year when the report came out, looking at how that applied to an international audience. Another question that I'll maybe sort of look for us to talk about, Purna, is does your research address how the most vulnerable women, young women, those in countries with high unemployment, best deal with sexual harassment without compromising their career, given the career insecurity they face? So you've already mentioned some of the work that you did about those insecure or the vulnerable workers. Do you have any reflections just to follow up on that question?
Well, I think we need to understand, issues around career trajectories and how power and inequality is structured in the workplace. And I think in industries where those insecurities are built into the systems, then the system makes people vulnerable. My slight concern about the notion of vulnerable people is that it places a vulnerability inherently within the person, rather than in systems and the structures which shape those vulnerabilities. So if you have temporary contracts, if you have casual labor, if you have almost patronage to go from casual to a proper contract, if you have networks that get you into jobs, you're dependent on so many other people and those relationships to be able to move forward. And in the UN, a lot of those issues apply, and in Hollywood, a lot of those issues apply, and in the informal sector, a lot of those issues apply, and they don't have to. They don't have to. And often where people are unionized, where they're organized, they can find their way around these sorts of structured inequalities. But I think what's very important is that all those organizations that quickly declare they have good policies and zero tolerance need to look at their systemic issues and structural underpinnings for those forms of inequality. And it's not only status inequality within an organization, it is about how those social structures of inequality, gender, race, ethnicity, immigration status, indigeneity, disability, sexual orientation, how they together weave the experiences of inequality and exposure to harassment, and the lack of credibility that it brings if you're at the bottom. And in inverse form, how much credibility that gives those people who enjoy those social situations of privilege. I often used to talk about one of my experiences of sexual harassment at work, which was from somebody who reported to me, but his male positioning in society gave him a particular sense of entitlement and what he expected to be advantage that I didn't have as a younger female who might have been who was his supervisor. So I think we need to bear those in mind. And let me also acknowledge, you talked about the girls organizing in school in Australia. University students in India did the same. Students in the UK in schools are doing the same. Ministers in Japan and in India have fallen. But one of the things I think we haven't done well enough, and you talked about those who are looking for their career to be protected and to have choices, is sufficiently understand, center, and learn from those who are at the juncture of different forms of inequality. In India, for example, the whole journey of the latest law around sexual harassment came from the gang rape of a low caste woman who was going about her job trying to stop child marriages, who was raped by upper caste men in whose community she was trying to stop a child marriage. But the court wouldn't believe that upper caste men would sexually abuse a lower caste woman. That happened in I'm forgetting the year, 93, I think it was. And, you know, I met her and talked to her about it again a few years ago. She still hasn't had justice. She still hasn't seen what she thinks could work for her and would bring her a sense of closure. So for me, I think that we, all of us, especially those in a position to make change at senior level, need to be placing those stories center stage. There's something I think we all must do and we're not comfortable doing, which is to ask, to listen and stop talking, and to use that as the basis for what needs to be done. I think we need those structural, institutional forms of creating vulnerability, creating minority status, need to be unpicked. Put people on contract. Why should you have unpaid interns? You know, the number of people at the UN who, and more are speaking to me now after I've left than even were there when I was there, who are frightened and who will not tell about what's happened to them because they fear their careers will be ruined. It's absolutely outrageous. This is the most significant fundamental form of inequality that we see around us, and we can easily stop. We can stop all of that. It doesn't mean sexual harassment will disappear, but it minimizes the chances of it happening without consequence, and it minimizes the chances of loss. Institutions, organizations lose a lot of good people because they experience abuse and they don't know what to do with it. They don't see justice and they move on. So their careers are spoiled, and those organizations are the worse off for losing that talent.
That's fantastic. Purna, I'm gonna, because I'm watching our time and
yes,
we need to wrap up. I would just mention, because we haven't got to discuss it, but there have been some great comments and questions which really do talk about that, which you touched on as well. We focus on the victim survivor, but that shift and the desire to start the conversation about the perpetrator, and we talk about violence against women, and that's suggesting that we've, you know, that's sort of hiding the violence by men and how we get into that conversation. So some really good questions there, but given the time, and I'm going to commit to our time frame, and I know you and I, so we have got through this whole period without talking about COVID, which, you know, you and I had talked about. We could discuss what that has meant for this conversation. We also, you and I have really strong views about how change happens. So maybe if we ever do Mark 2, we can go into lots of other of those topics. But in closing, and thank you everyone for attending, I do want, Purna, for you to talk about your plans for the future, and we will be promoting on our social media channels, but you as well. But can you tell us about the conference you've got planned for August?
Thank you, Kate. Thanks for the opportunity to do that. I'm really, really happy to be able to say that I'm involved in organising what we're calling a Reykjavik dialogue in August this year, which will be a convening placing activists and survivors and victims centre stage in developing a plan, an agenda of action to end violence over the next 5 years. We plan for this to be a 3-day event from the 16th to the 18th of August. It is co-hosted by the Prime Minister of Iceland and the Mayor of Reykjavik, and it is in the year that the Generation Equality Forum is happening, and a year after Beijing Plus 25, and it's a chance to focus specifically on violence, not gender equality as a whole, but specifically on violence, with activists as the core, in honor of the fact that activists and survivors and victims are those who put this on the agenda decades ago in many different parts of the world, and to put them back in the center and the ownership of a discussion. What would our work look like if activists and victims and survivors were in the lead? And they talked in the way that we talked 20, 30 years ago. I'm not unhappy that institutions and organizations take up the work, but they make it their own, they make it their language, they make it work for their organizations. This is slightly slipping the other way and putting them in the driving seat. And so I think you have a link to the website for the conference. Thank you for sharing that. The registrations are open. It will be free to attend. We don't know if we'll be able to meet in person yet, but COVID conditions allowing, we will have a small number of people attending in Reykjavik itself. And we have funding for people from the Global South to attend. You can apply for those scholarships. Please come. And the other thing, even if you can't actually be there in person, we want to honour the activists. We want to honour the troublemakers, the agitators, those who have fought and fought and fought and taken consequences for being outspoken. And we have a website there where we will honour activism. So please feel free to send in videos, photographs, acknowledgement, and we will build a resource of these that will be available to everybody after the event. Please join us. It's time for us to take charge.
Thank you very much, Purna. And I do, because of the time, have to close this discussion. I so appreciate, Purna, you making your time for us. I know you had to stay up later. I'm bright and early, and you're at the end of your day in London. I also want to thank everyone who has joined us and encourage, if you found this useful for you, to share the link as we go. And I wish for everyone a continued productive, inspiring CSW 65 in whatever country and wherever you are. And I appreciate your interest in this topic. And I look forward to staying in touch with you in probably by social media or other mechanisms. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks to everybody.